This story follows Noah Carter, a 10-year-old biracial boy who shocks the family court system by standing up for his mother in a custody battle against his wealthy, absentee father. With nothing but a notebook, a library card, and a burning sense of justice, Noah challenges the assumptions of every adult in the room. And through the eyes of the judge herself, we see a boy who is not just fighting for his home, but reshaping what justice should mean for all children. It began on a rainy Thursday morning in Brooklyn Family Court. The courtroom was quiet, solemn humming with the dull rhythm of legal procedure. Judge Ellen Monroe, a sharp woman in her early 60s, with years of hard-won authority behind her eyes, was flipping through a stack of documents with her usual efficiency when she heard a small voice cut through the silence. "I'm representing my mother today." The words landed like a dropped glass. Monroe froze. She looked up over her reading glasses toward the boy standing next to the defendant's table. Slightly short for his age, with warm caramel skin and tight curls pulled back from his forehead, Noah Carter stood calmly beside his mother Angela, a nursing assistant with tired eyes and a simple blouse that looked ironed 3 times over. Angela's mouth had parted mid-breath, clearly not expecting this. Across the courtroom, Marcus Langston nearly dropped his stainless steel coffee thermos. He leaned toward his legal team, 3 sharply dressed men, whose faces had morphed from confidence to confusion in seconds. "I beg your pardon," Judge Monroe asked, her voice steady, but surprised. "I'm my mother's legal advocate, Your Honor," Noah said clearly. "And according to Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, ratified by the United States in 1995, I have the right to express my views in all matters affecting me. And this custody hearing affects me directly." Monroe blinked. She'd been a judge for over 25 years, had presided over hundreds of custody disputes, and had seen all kinds of stunts from desperate parents and eccentric lawyers. But she had never seen a child quote international law from memory. "Do you have a lawyer, Mr. Carter?" she asked, defaulting to formal process. "No, ma'am," Noah replied. "We can't afford one." Monroe glanced toward the opposing table, where Marcus Langston, a multi-millionaire investor, known for his luxury developments and aggressive corporate takeovers, sat fuming. Dr. Graham Langston's lead attorney stood and adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a legal proceeding for adults. The child's presence at the table is irregular. So is filing for custody of a child you've ignored for 10 years, Noah said calmly, flipping open a blue spiral notebook filled with tight, careful handwriting. Monroe raised a hand before Dr. Graham could respond. "Enough. I will allow the boy to speak for now. Mr. Langston, sit down. Let's hear what he has to say." Angela leaned down, whispering urgently, "Noah, baby, we talked about this. This isn't your burden. It's mine whether I speak or not," Mom Noah whispered back without taking his eyes off the judge. Monroe leaned back slightly. The boy's tone wasn't defiant. It wasn't rehearsed. It was matter of fact. A quiet dignity, wrapped in childlike calm. She scribbled a quick note on her legal pad monitor tone. "Genuine, proceed." "Mr. Carter," she said aloud. Noah cleared his throat and began reading from his notebook. "Your Honor, I'm here because I believe my father's request for custody is not about my well-being, but about money. In the last 2 months, I've researched public court records, corporate filings, and press reports. I discovered my father is facing multiple lawsuits, financial losses, and is under investigation for securities violations." At this, Marcus slammed his hand lightly on the table. "This is insane. He's a child. And yet Noah said I have documentation. I can submit it." Monroe found herself suppressing the faintest flicker of a smile. Not amusement, admiration. Still, she had to maintain control. "Let's take this one step at a time. You say you've done research. Where? The Brooklyn Public Library," Noah said proudly. "Tuesdays and Thursdays after school. Ms. Chen, the reference librarian, showed me how to use LexisNexis and ProPublica archives. She said, information is power." Angela looked at her son like she didn't recognize him, like someone had switched her child with a miniature civil rights lawyer. Monroe glanced again at her notes. Librarian verified. "And what exactly do you believe your father's motive is?" Monroe asked. Noah flipped to a new page and read. 2 weeks before he filed for custody, my grandfather, Elijah Langston, passed away. He was a civil rights lawyer and left behind a $2.5 million trust fund in my name. It's accessible to my father only if he has full legal custody of me. Dead silence. Marcus stiffened. His lawyers stared at the boy like he'd turned into a Molotov cocktail. Monroe sat up straighter. She had reviewed the trust on file, but hadn't noticed the clause. Perhaps because she hadn't expected a 10-year-old to uncover it. Noah continued. My grandfather didn't trust my father. That's why he wrote the clause. I found the trust conditions in the estate filing. Monroe turned to the court clerk. Get me the full estate file. Immediately. Then to Noah. Did your mother know about this? Angela's head moved slowly. No. I didn't even know there was a trust fund. Elijah and I hadn't spoken in years. Monroe studied her face. Honest, shocked, tired. Judge Monroe had thought today would be routine. A powerful man, a struggling woman, a child too young to testify. An inevitable ruling. But this child wasn't testifying. He was building a case, piece by piece. And she, someone who believed herself immune to drama and sentiment, was finding it hard to remain detached. She picked up her gavel, then stopped mid-motion. Noah Carter. She said slowly, I have no idea what's going to come out of this hearing. But I can tell you this, you have my attention. And just like that, the courtroom changed. No longer a space ruled by protocol and imbalance. It had become a stage where a child not yet tall enough to ride every amusement park ride had stood eye to eye with power and refused to look away. Noah Carter Judge Monroe had said, her voice calm but unmistakably altered. You have my attention. But attention was only the beginning. In the moments that followed, the courtroom sat frozen, not because of any order from the bench, but because no one quite knew what came next. A boy had stepped beyond the script, and now the adults, judges, lawyers, even parents were scrambling to catch up to him. Monroe glanced at the clerk, who was still flipping through the estate documents she'd requested. Across the room, Marcus Langston sat rigid in his chair, his lips pursed into a tight line. Beside him, Dr. Graham was murmuring urgently into a cell phone, likely trying to verify whether the boy had just detonated the legal equivalent of a hand grenade. But Noah stood quietly, flipping a page in his notebook, like he was in a classroom presentation, not a $1 million custody case. I'm not finished, Your Honor, he said politely. Monroe arched an eyebrow. Go on. Noah adjusted his posture, glanced briefly at his mother, who still looked like she might pass out, and returned to his notes. There's a pattern, he said, his voice steady. A pattern of absence, then sudden interest. My father came to see me 4 times in 10 years. Each time he brought something expensive. A drone, a video game console, once a basketball signed by someone he said was a celebrity, but I'd never heard of. He never stayed more than 20 minutes. He never asked what I liked, or what I was afraid of, or what I wanted to be. Angela lowered her eyes. And then, Noah continued. 6 months ago, he came to our apartment again. He made a lot of comments about the furniture, about how our place smelled like hospital beds and disinfectant. He said if I had any hope of becoming something, I'd need structure and exposure. That's the phrase he used. Noah flipped another page. 2 weeks after that, he filed for custody. The courtroom remained silent. Dr. Graham finally hung up the phone and whispered something to Marcus, but Langston didn't respond. Judge Monroe leaned forward slightly. You believe this was a calculated move? I know it was, Noah said, because I've been watching, and listening, and reading. There it was again, that eerie calm. Monroe had seen it before, but never in someone so young. It wasn't bravado or precocious arrogance. It was precision. This boy wasn't here to perform. He was here to win. I started reading about family law 6 months ago, Noah said, lifting his notebook. I wanted to understand what would happen if I ended up living with a man I didn't know, who didn't know me, but who suddenly wanted to make every decision about my life. Monroe let out a slow breath. And what did you find? That most judges don't talk to kids. That they assume adults always know better. That if no one listens to what I say, I could be taken away from the only home I've ever known. Not because it's unsafe, but because it's not. Impressive. He paused. My mom works 70 hours a week and still makes time to ask me how school went. She packed my lunch this morning, even though her shift at the hospital ended at 3:00 a.m. We don't have much, but we have respect and honesty. A beat of silence. Then another. I don't know if that's in the custody guidelines, but it should be, Noah said quietly. Monroe pressed her lips together. She'd seen parents with every advantage, money homes, nannies, private schools fail to offer their children even a fraction of that. Still, her job was to weigh law, not sentiment. Mr. Carter, she said, you've stated your position clearly. But you're not an attorney. You don't have standing. Noah didn't flinch. Neither do most kids, and that's the problem. No one asks us. Not really. Not until it's too late. Angela put a trembling hand on his shoulder, but Noah stayed focused. Your Honor, I understand legal process is important. But what about lived experience? If the person most affected by the decision isn't allowed to speak, then who is this process for? Monroe blinked slowly. The question lingered like incense. Dr. Graham finally stood. This is highly irregular, Judge Monroe. This child is emotionally involved. Of course, he doesn't want to leave his mother. That doesn't make his arguments legally sound. Noah looked up at the lawyer and said without sarcasm, would you want to leave your mother to live with someone you barely know, just because they had nicer shoes? The gallery murmured again. Monroe rapped her gavel once, not harshly, just enough to restore order. Dr. Graham, she said, I understand your objection. I also understand that this child has presented more coherent arguments than most of the junior associates who stand before me. She turned back to Noah. You mentioned earlier that you had documentation. What kind of documentation? Noah reached into his backpack and pulled out a thin blue folder. He walked it across the courtroom and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Monroe. Inside were printed copies of court cases involving Marcus Langston's company's bankruptcy filings, a timeline of his recent financial downturns, and a public notice of a pending SEC investigation. Monroe skimmed the pages, her expression unreadable. You compiled this yourself? She asked. Yes, ma'am, Noah said. With help? Yes. Ms. Chen at the library showed me how to search databases and check sources. She used to be a paralegal. Monroe nodded slowly, then closed the folder. Her voice was quieter when she spoke next. This case is not over, Mr. Carter, but I will be reviewing this documentation carefully. In the meantime, you may remain at your mother's table. For now, the court is adjourned until Monday morning. She banged the gavel and stood. As Monroe left the bench and entered the hallway beyond, she paused in front of a narrow window and looked out at the gray drizzle misting the courthouse steps. In all her years, she had never seen anything like him, and for the first time in a long time, she wondered not what the law allowed, but whether it was still enough. Judge Monroe stood by the narrow courthouse window for a long moment, her arms folded, eyes tracing the streaks of rain as they slid down the glass. She didn't like the question forming in her mind. Is the law enough? That kind of doubt had no place on the bench. And yet, a 10-year-old with a backpack full of documents had managed to wedge that very question deep into the foundations of her belief in the system. By Monday morning, she had read the entire contents of Noah's folder, twice. The courtroom reconvened promptly at 9 a.m. Monroe entered with her usual composed demeanor, but those who paid close attention like Noah could see something different in her expression. A readiness, an openness, a decision not yet made, but certainly no longer dismissed. As everyone took their seats, Monroe began. Before we proceed with further testimony, I have reviewed the materials submitted by Mr. Noah Carter. In my judgment, while unconventional in format, the information appears to be credible, sourced from public records and relevant to this custody petition. Dr. Graham shifted in his seat, clearly bracing for damage control. Marcus Langston stared straight ahead, stone-faced. Noah, sitting upright beside his mother, gave a slight nod. Not smug, not proud, just grounded, ready. Monroe continued. Given the weight of this evidence, I am compelled to ask the petitioner, Mr. Langston, to clarify his financial position and the timeline of this custody filing. Graham rose immediately. Your Honor, my client is under no obligation to disclose private financial details in a custody hearing. Then perhaps you'd like to explain why a trust fund worth $2.5 million left by Elijah Langston to his grandson is contingent upon Mr. Langston gaining legal custody, and why the custody request was filed precisely 2 weeks after the trust was formalized in probate court. Silence. Only the sound of a pencil breaking in Angela's trembling hand. Monroe turned to Marcus. Mr. Langston, you may answer directly. Marcus leaned into the mic, his voice cold. The trust is none of the boy's concern. He doesn't even understand what it means. I filed for custody because I believe it's in his best interest. He understands more than you think, Monroe replied. Dr. Graham interjected again, more carefully this time. Your Honor, Noah is clearly bright, but he is still a child. His interpretations are shaped by emotional loyalty, not legal comprehension. Perhaps, Monroe said. But emotional loyalty doesn't explain the level of detail in this documentation. He didn't just cite headlines, he traced transactions. He matched court filings with company dates. This was not a child grasping for straws. This was research. Noah spoke gently. May I respond? Your Honor. Monroe paused, then nodded. I didn't mean to embarrass anyone, he said, looking not at the judge, but at his father. I just didn't want someone using me to fix their mistakes. You've had a whole life without me. I get that. But don't pretend this is about me now. Marcus flinched just slightly. Angela reached for her son's hand but didn't interrupt. There was a quiet dignity in her restraint. She let him lead. Noah turned back to the judge. My grandfather didn't know me well, but he tried to protect me. I found something else in the probate files, a letter. It was sealed in a side envelope, marked for release at age 16. But in contested custody cases, minors can access correspondence related to the estate earlier. Ms. Chen helped me request it. Dr. Graham jumped in. That's a complete breach. It's legal, Noah replied. The court allowed the release. I have a copy. He reached into his folder and pulled out a photocopy of a typed letter signed Elijah M. Langston. Monroe signaled for the bailiff to retrieve it. She scanned it quietly as the courtroom held its collective breath. The letter was short, but every word struck home. Elijah expressed concern that his son Marcus had repeatedly failed to demonstrate integrity in personal relationships, and specifically warned that custody should not be sought unless driven by care, not commerce. He concluded, if Marcus files for custody only after my passing, consider it suspect. My hope is that Noah grows in truth, not transaction. Monroe looked up slowly, her voice low. This letter changes the nature of this case. Dr. Graham stood visibly sweating now. Your Honor, this is highly prejudicial. No, Counselor Monroe cut him off. This is highly relevant. Marcus's composure finally cracked. I don't have to sit here and be accused by a ghost. My father didn't trust anyone, not even his own wife. That letter doesn't mean anything. Angela spoke for the first time. Then why did you hide it? Marcus turned on her. Don't act like you're innocent. You cut me off from my son. You were never there to cut off, she replied quietly. Monroe tapped her gavel once. Enough. This courtroom will maintain order. But it was too late. The mask had slipped. Marcus wasn't angry because of the evidence. He was angry because he'd lost control of the narrative. And everyone in that room saw it. Noah folded the letter and placed it back into his folder. I just want to stay with my mom, he said. That's all I've ever wanted." Monroe looked at him, truly looked. Not as a minor on a docket, not as a disruption to courtroom protocol, but as a person. She made a note in her legal pad. Too many kids know the law better than those meant to protect them. And as she looked up from her writing, she realized something else. This case wasn't just about custody. It was about custody of truth. And this boy had been holding it all along. Judge Monroe tapped her pen softly against the wooden desk, her thoughts drifting to the line she had just written. Too many kids know the law better than those meant to protect them. It lingered in her mind, like a truth too inconvenient to say aloud in her courtroom, and yet impossible to ignore now. The courtroom remained hushed, suspended in that fragile silence that always follows an emotional shift. Marcus Langston sat back in his chair, seething. Angela wiped her eyes with a tissue she'd pulled from her sleeve. And Noah, calm as ever, was neatly organizing his notes again, preparing perhaps instinctively for what would come next. Monroe cleared her throat and addressed the courtroom. "We will now continue with the presentation of evidence. Mr. Carter, do you have anything further you wish to submit to the court?" "Yes, Your Honor," Noah replied. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small black digital recorder. "This is a recording I made during my father's last visit to our apartment. I believe it contains statements relevant to his true intentions regarding this custody case." Marcus straightened abruptly. "Absolutely not. That was a private conversation." Monroe didn't flinch. "Mr. Langston, was this conversation held in a private setting with an expectation of confidentiality?" "It was in their apartment, for God's sake," he snapped. "Did you know you were being recorded?" Marcus hesitated. "No." Monroe turned to Noah. "Explain the context." Noah nodded. "My father was in the living room speaking on the phone. He didn't know I was home yet. I was in my room doing homework, but I'd left the recorder on the kitchen table. Ms. Chen had told me that gathering documented evidence is important, so I started recording any time I felt something important was being said about me." "And what's on the tape?" Monroe asked, her voice careful. Noah pressed the play button. The audio began with faint background noise, a chair scraping the sound of a zipper. Then, Marcus's voice came through clearly. "I just need full custody. That's the key. Once I've got the legal paperwork, the trust opens up. The boy goes to that place in Colorado Ridgewell or whatever. It's strict isolated. They'll keep him busy until he turns 18. Meanwhile, I can manage the funds. It's an elegant solution." The room seemed to inhale all at once. "Exactly." Marcus continued on the tape. "500 a month for the school, the rest is mine to allocate. No one's asking questions. Kid doesn't even need to know. And Angela. She's out of the picture." Angela's face paled. She turned her eyes away from Marcus, as if trying not to let him see the hurt he had inflicted. Noah, meanwhile, watched the judge. Monroe signaled to pause the playback. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice sharper now, "is that your voice on this recording?" Marcus didn't answer. "Counselor," she pressed. Dr. Graham adjusted his glasses, his voice brittle. "Your Honor, we cannot authenticate this recording." "I didn't edit it," Noah said simply. "You can test it." Monroe held up a hand. "I will request an independent verification of the file's integrity. But for now, this court will treat the content as provisionally admissible pending confirmation." Marcus finally exploded. "You're taking the word of a child who trapped me in my own home." "No," Monroe replied. "I'm taking the word of a child who prepared a stronger case than the three of your attorneys combined." Noah pressed play again. "The problem is, he's too observant." Marcus's voice returned. "He watches everything. You give him one slip, and he latches onto it. That's dangerous. He asks questions. Too many. And when kids like that start asking questions, well, they start pulling threads." Noah turned the recorder off. "I wasn't trying to trap anyone," he said, quieter now. "I just didn't want to be sent away without anyone knowing why." The judge leaned back in her chair, folding her hands. "Tell me about the school in Colorado. It's a military-style academy. Ridgewell Behavioral Institute. My father said he was researching it. I did too. He pulled out a printed report and passed it to the bailiff. 3 suicides in 5 years. The school is under federal review. Allegations of physical abuse, isolation tactics, and forced silence policies. It's not a school, it's a facility. Angela's hand gripped the edge of the table. Her son had never told her this part. She looked like the floor had just fallen out from under her. Monroe scanned the document, jaw tightening. Dr. Graham stood. Your Honor, even if we accepted this as true, the court must still weigh comparative resources. Mr. Langston can provide a vastly superior educational path. Superior to what Noah cut in the anger in his voice finally showing. To being locked away until I'm old enough not to matter anymore. To being separated from my mom, so someone else can manage my money while calling it parenting. The question hit hard. Even the stenographer stopped typing for a beat. Monroe glanced around the courtroom, then spoke softly but firmly. I will not tolerate another interruption from counsel today. Mr. Langston's intent is now under serious scrutiny. And I will remind everyone in this room, custody is not a prize. It is a responsibility. Noah nodded, his voice calm again. That's all I've been trying to say. And in that moment, the courtroom seemed to shift around him. Not a boy speaking up, but a young man standing firmly on the foundation he had built, word by word, fact by fact, truth by truth. Judge Monroe looked down at the report, then back up at the boy. She didn't say it out loud, but she thought it. This child is not the one on trial here. Not anymore. Judge Monroe didn't say it aloud, but the thought reverberated in her mind long after the courtroom emptied that day. This child is not the one on trial here. Not anymore. The bailiff had escorted Marcus Langston out, first his jaw-clenched eyes, darting like a man realizing too late that his empire was crumbling from within. Angela and Noah had left quietly afterward, arms linked, not saying much, but saying everything through the way they held on to each other. That night, Monroe sat alone in her chambers, the glow of her desk lamp softening the edges of a day that had felt anything but soft. The letter from Elijah Langston was still spread open on the table beside her, and beside it the printed report on Ridgewell Academy, its margins marked with red flags in her own neat handwriting. But her eyes weren't on the documents, they were on the recorder. The small black device Noah had left with the clerk for evidence preservation. He had insisted. It was still on her desk. She had listened to the clip 3 times already. Not because she didn't believe it was real, but because she couldn't stop thinking about how calm Noah had been. Not once had his voice cracked. Not once had he looked for someone to step in. He had stood in a courtroom filled with suits, power, and cynicism, and refused to flinch. Why didn't anyone prepare me for this? She thought. Not for the legal chaos that was standard, but for the clarity of it. The clarity only a child could bring. She stood and walked to the narrow bookshelf in her office. Tucked between 2 volumes of family law commentary was an older book, one she hadn't opened in years, Children and the Courts, Rights Roles, and Reality. She flipped to a chapter she barely remembered. A line caught her attention. The law protects children, but rarely invites them to speak. We underestimate their voice and lose justice in the silence. Justice in the silence. She sat back down. The next day, Monroe entered the courtroom without the usual preamble. There was no need to reassert authority. The room already felt different. Everyone could feel it, like something inevitable was building. Noah sat beside Angela again. Same notebook, same backpack, same calm. But his eyes, Monroe noticed, were tired. Not the tired of a child who stayed up past bedtime. The tired of someone who'd carried too much for too long. Before we proceed with additional witness testimony, Monroe said, I'd like to make a statement for the record. The room stilled. In my 30 years on the bench, I have presided over more than 900 family court cases. Many of them complex, painful, and deeply contested. But few, if any, have revealed the failure of adult institutions more clearly than this one. She turned slightly toward Noah. When a 10-year-old boy walks into a courtroom better prepared than the counsel representing his own father, when that boy presents legal documents, recorded evidence, and first-hand testimony with clarity and composure, we do not merely have a child making noise. We have a citizen invoking rights that most adults forget they even have. Noah blinked slowly, uncertain whether to look away or hold the gaze. I want to be clear, Monroe continued. The court is still evaluating all evidence, and a ruling will be made based on the law. But it would be negligent not to acknowledge what's already undeniable. This child has become not only a participant in this process, but its most honest voice. Doctor, Graham opened his mouth but thought better of it. Monroe turned to him anyway. Counselor, your client has not disputed the contents of the recording, nor has he explained the choice of Ridgewell Academy, an institution under active federal review. We believe the court is allowing sentimentality to overshadow reason, Graham replied tightly. The father has financial resources the mother cannot match. Monroe raised an eyebrow. And yet, the mother has offered something neither money nor education guarantees presence. She looked down at her notes. Mr. Carter, she said, do you wish to submit anything further? Noah nodded. One last thing. He unzipped the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out a single envelope carefully sealed. This was handed to me by Ms. Chen yesterday. It's a letter from another kid at Ridgewell. He saw my story online. He sent this to the library. He passed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to Monroe. She opened it. The handwriting was shaky, the grammar unpolished. But the words hit like truth always does. They took my phone. I can't talk to my mom without someone listening. I haven't seen the son in 4 weeks. Don't let them send anyone else here. Please. It was signed Tyrell, age 12. The letter had been dated 2 weeks ago. Monroe folded it gently and set it atop the report. Thank you, Mr. Carter, she said. Angela looked at her son, her mouth slightly open. You never told me about this letter. Noah shrugged softly. I didn't want to scare you, but I couldn't let it be ignored. Monroe looked directly at the court reporter. Let the record reflect that this child submitted corroborating testimony from a current student at Ridgewell Academy, further supporting allegations of systemic neglect and abuse. And then she turned to Marcus Langston. Mr. Langston, would you like to respond? He remained silent. Noah broke the silence instead. Your Honor, I know my father's not evil. I don't think he set out to hurt me. I just think he doesn't see me. He sees a solution. He sees a number on a sheet. But I'm not a problem to solve. There it was again, that unmistakable clarity. Judge Monroe nodded slowly. Court will reconvene tomorrow, at which point I will deliver my ruling. She rose and exited the bench, passing once again through that narrow hallway behind the courtroom. But this time, she didn't stop at the window. She already knew what she was going to say. Judge Monroe didn't stop at the window this time. She moved with quiet purpose down the corridor, the weight of tomorrow's ruling already settled in her bones. Her mind echoed with Noah's words, I'm not a problem to solve. It wasn't the legal evidence that made her decision feel clear now. It was the human truth behind every fact the boy had laid down, each more sobering than the last. The following morning, the courtroom was more crowded than usual. Word had spread not just about the high-profile nature of the case, or Marcus Langston's public fall, but about the boy, the one who had spoken without trembling, who had presented his life like a brief and his fears like evidence. There were reporters in the hallway, school staff, quietly seated in the back row, and even Ms. Chen, the librarian, present in person for the first time. Monroe entered with her usual authority, but today her voice was even weighted decisive. This court is now in session. We are here to deliver a ruling in the matter of Langston versus Carter, a petition for custody brought by Mr. Marcus Langston against Ms. Angela Carter. Noah's hand was already holding his mother's. Angela's breathing was uneven, but she kept her eyes fixed on the judge. Across the aisle, Marcus sat cold and motionless, a pale mask of entitlement turned hollow. Monroe continued. Custody cases often pit resources against relationships, status against stability. In many cases, that tension alone clouds the court's vision. But this case brought clarity. Not because the facts were simple, but because the voice at the center refused to be silenced. She paused, letting the words sink in. In reviewing all documentation, including public financial records, recorded conversations, trust conditions, and third-party testimonies, the court finds the petitioner's motives inconsistent with the best interests of the child. A rustle of movement spread through the courtroom. Therefore, I am denying Mr. Langston's petition for custody in full. Legal guardianship shall remain with Ms. Angela Carter. Angela let out a trembling breath, her lips barely parting her body, shaking from the release of 1,000 days of tension. But Monroe wasn't finished. Furthermore, based on compelling evidence presented regarding financial misconduct and a potential attempt to exploit a minor's trust for personal gain, this court is recommending that Mr. Langston be referred for investigation by the District Attorney's Office for fraud and attempted breach of fiduciary responsibility. Marcus didn't react, not visibly, but the muscles in his jaw twitched. And finally, Monroe added, "This court is initiating an emergency review of Ridgewell Academy, in coordination with the state's Department of Child Welfare." Noah turned toward the back of the courtroom, where Ms. Chen stood beside a man Noah didn't know, an older gentleman in a gray blazer, who nodded toward him with approval. Noah didn't smile, but something inside him loosened. A knot released. Monroe leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, would you like to say anything? Before I formally close this hearing." Noah stood slow and sure. "Just this," he said. "I didn't do any of this because I wanted to be noticed. I did it because I knew if I didn't speak, no one else would. I hope that next time a kid doesn't have to go this far to be heard." The courtroom stood still again, not tense, awed. Angela pulled him close, kissed the side of his head, and whispered, "You saved us." But Noah just shook his head. "You saved me first." As Monroe banged the gavel and brought the hearing to a close, the gallery erupted in applause, not because it was appropriate, but because it was real. From the back of the room, Ms. Chen wiped her eyes. A few rows ahead, a law clerk silently turned and stared at the boy she'd dismissed as just another kid with a notebook 2 weeks earlier. Outside, cameras waited, but Angela shielded her son as best she could as they left. They moved slowly through a maze of reporters, asking questions about how a child had changed the system. But Noah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that evening, as dusk painted their small apartment with gold, Noah sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, sifting through the stack of letters and messages that had begun to pour in. Some from kids, some from teachers. One from a law student who wrote, "You reminded me why I went into this field." Angela appeared at the door, holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. "Room for one more." Noah smiled and nodded. They sat in silence for a while, sipping slowly. "I don't think I want to be a lawyer," Noah said eventually. Angela raised her eyebrows. No. I think I want to teach kids their rights, before they ever have to use them in court." Angela blinked back a tear. "Then that's what we'll do." Down the hall, a news anchor's voice echoed from the living room TV. Today, a Brooklyn custody case sparked national attention when a 10-year-old boy presented evidence so thorough it led not only to a legal victory, but potentially to sweeping changes in how children's voices are handled in the legal system. Angela reached for the remote and clicked it off. Noah didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew. Tomorrow would come, and he would face it with the same notebook, the same questions, and now with a world that was finally listening. Noah didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew. Tomorrow would come, and he would face it with the same notebook, the same questions, and now with a world that was finally listening. That tomorrow arrived faster than anyone expected. 3 weeks after Judge Monroe's ruling, a clip from the courtroom, specifically the moment Noah declared, "I'm not a problem to solve" went viral. It started on a legal advocacy blog, shared quietly among public defenders and family court activists. But within days, it spread to mainstream outlets, school forums, parent groups, even late-night television. Within 2 months, Noah Carter had become a national conversation. Not a celebrity, not a child prodigy, something rarer, a symbol. Reporters asked for interviews. Law schools requested permission to use his hearing transcript in ethics classes. A university offered Angela a full scholarship to complete her nursing degree, citing outstanding maternal resilience. But none of that changed their morning routine. Noah still ate toast with honey before school. Angela still walked him to the bus when she wasn't working early shifts. And every Thursday afternoon, he still showed up at the Brooklyn Public Library to volunteer in the new Kid Justice Corner, a project he'd co-designed with Ms. Chen. It was there, seated at a small round table beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "Every child has a voice," that he met Maya Thomas. Maya was 8, thin, quiet, curious. Her mother was being threatened with eviction, and no one at school believed her when she said her building had been without hot water for 2 weeks. She sat across from Noah with a folder in her lap, not speaking at first. He waited. Then, in a small voice, she asked, "How do you get grown-ups to believe you?" Noah smiled. "You show them the rules, and then you show them they're breaking them." He handed her a library tablet. "Want to learn how to pull housing code violations?" Maya nodded. The story that had started in a courtroom was evolving into something else. Noah wasn't just being heard, he was helping others speak. And Judge Monroe. She was still listening. After the case, Monroe took a 2-week leave, something she hadn't done in a decade. When she returned, she requested reassignment from high-conflict divorce dockets to youth advocacy reform. Her clerks were stunned. She didn't explain. But on her desk, next to her framed law degree and brass gavel, she placed a photograph Noah at the Kid Justice Corner, seated between 2 younger boys, all 3 hunched over a book titled, "Know Your Rights Before You Need Them." In early spring, Monroe testified before the State Judicial Oversight Committee, pushing for a new pilot initiative called YVP Youth Voice Participation, a structured pathway for children over the age of 7 to contribute to legal proceedings that directly impacted their lives. The proposal was met with cautious optimism. "It's not about turning children into lawyers," Monroe said in her testimony. "It's about reminding courts that listening is not weakness, it's justice." The proposal passed in committee with a unanimous vote. Back in Brooklyn, Noah was unaware of most of this. He was busy compiling digital guides for the Libra Rights app, a mobile resource for kids in crisis. It explained things like custody terms, housing laws, and even how to safely record conversations if they feared harm. The app had been downloaded 10,000 times within the first month. One evening, as Angela cooked dinner, she looked over and found Noah sketching ideas for a new logo. "You don't get tired?" she asked. "Of helping," he replied. "No, of being treated like I don't know anything." "That, yeah." She came over and placed a hand on his back. "Well, they're listening now." He smiled. "Some of them." "More than before," she said. A pause. Then Noah added, "Do you think Judge Monroe ever gets tired?" Angela looked thoughtful. "Maybe. But I think she decided it was better to get tired doing the right thing." 6 months later, a ceremony was held at the state capitol. The governor signed the Youth Voice Act into law. It mandated that in any legal proceeding involving custody guardianship or state intervention, children age 7 and up must be given a formal opportunity to speak through direct statement, a written letter, or verified third-party interviews. The act was nicknamed Noah's Law in the media. Noah never asked for that. But when the plaque was unveiled bearing his name, he smiled politely and said, "I hope no kid ever needs this law, but I'm glad it's there." After the cameras, after the speeches, he and Judge Monroe stood together for a moment on the Capitol steps. "You know," Monroe said, "I spent decades thinking courtrooms were for adults only." Noah looked at her. "Me too." They laughed, quiet, honest, a shared relief between 2 people who had once stood on opposite sides of a bench, and now shared the same mission. As they turned to leave, Monroe asked, "So, law school?" Noah grinned. "Maybe. But first I'm starting a podcast with some friends." She raised an eyebrow. "It's called We Object," he said. "All kid-led. First episode's on how to file a complaint against your landlord nicely." Monroe laughed louder this time. And as Noah walked down those steps, notebook in hand, something became clear. He hadn't just won a case. He had redrawn the map for every child who came after him, so they'd know exactly where to stand and how to speak when the world tried to pretend they had nothing to say.